some analysis now with Professor Siphamandla Zondi, just to give us a sense of how he looks at this summit. He is, of course, an international relations expert, a director of the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation at the University of Johannesburg. Good afternoon, Prof, and welcome to today. Well, we just got a sense of the latest from St. Petersburg now from our correspondent there a short while ago. But just from an analysis perspective, I mean, how important was this summit, especially considering it's coming at the back of this Ukraine conflict? Africa has put its voice on the table to say this, you need dialogue to end this conflict. We are affected, particularly around the grain imports, as well as the fact that only 17 African heads of state attended it.
Yes, it is a very significant summit for Russia. It's in the middle of a war. Countries don't normally host these multi-country discussions in the middle of the war. They often cancel everything and try and focus on trying to pick out some victory or some advances in the war situation. But they've decided to do this to create a sense of normality that they continue to look at. But second, very important for Russia, because in the time when the Western countries are isolating Russia, Russia needs almost every little friend, even if they have nothing to contribute, but it needs it in order to counter the isolation. It's also significant for the relationship between Russia and Africa that the first summit in 2019 took place. It was meant to check up this relationship, that this summit comes back to review the progress of what is done and also try to push it. For Africa, it's also an opportunity for Africa to make two messages: that it is opposed to the violation of national sovereignty, such as happened when Russia invaded Ukraine, but secondly, that Africa is interested in seeing progress in relation to the peace initiative that Africa placed on the table, which is what I think forced the Russian government to indicate that it is committed to explore how that peace initiative could change the situation on the ground towards peace. And therefore, the Africans have actually used this summit to kind of push for peace, to persuade the Russian government in the direction of peace. But whether that would actually happen is something we can only judge 5 years down the line, when we look back to see how the war in Ukraine ends in the end, and by what means.
Yeah, the minimum we know, as Isabel reported there a short while ago, is that President Vladimir Putin saying he's listening carefully to all these inputs from Africa around the issue of the conflict. Our president earlier, we played a bite from President Ramaphosa earlier. He spoke about a proposed Africa-Russia action plan for the coming years. We're still going to get the details of that maybe in their final communique of this summit later on. But he made the point that it should be aligned with the second 10-year implementation plan of the AU's Agenda 2063. I mean, that's an important point to make, that it cannot be in isolation of what Africa itself is trying to achieve.
It began at a time when Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma was the chairperson of the AU Commission, and then set up a process to look at what is called strategic partnerships Africa was having: the EU, Russia, with China, with Turkey, with Iran, a number of other countries, and to look at how do you make sure that these are not simply nice expos, simply chips and picture opportunities, but that these reinforce Africa's own interest. And Africa's interest is best expressed in Agenda 2063 and those 7 aspirations and all that. If the Russia-Africa Forum cannot show how it addresses some of those 7 aspirations that are Agenda 2063, then we do not need this forum, except for really warming up the relationship. But Africa cannot ill afford to have relations where we're simply warming up the relationship, but we need ones where it could lead to concrete outcomes in relation to economy, in relation to technology transfer, in relation to industrialization, in relation to agricultural development, and all of those things that are now being emphasized on that. And the idea of an action plan says you move from a declaration of commitment to actually binding yourself to measurable goals and targets that we can look at a year later and see whether this relationship is deepening or this relationship is simply just used for window dressing.
Okay. In terms of the summit itself, I just want to ask you this question and get your views, Prof. Only 17 African heads of state present in St. Petersburg for this summit. The number was much higher in 2019. I've seen some commentators alluding to the fact that some African leaders might have been hesitant, or they might have come under pressure from the West, which currently has imposed sanctions against Russia due to its invasion of Ukraine. How should we interpret the numbers, one, to say there were only 17, Africa has got more than 50 countries? Should we also assume that there was some pressure coming from some Western partners that some of these African states may have?
It is the largest number of heads of state that Russia has hosted since it invaded Ukraine. For it is a huge boon. Even if there were 8, it would still be a largest number. It's hosted individual heads of state here and there. That 17 African countries braved all manner of pressure, all manner of moral dilemma, and they went in there. It shows that in some cases, some countries are willing to be independent enough to risk all the penalties and all the negative ramifications that could come out of countries not heeding the call from Western powers not to attend this. Because for Western powers, this attendance and this activity undermines the agenda of isolation. And all of that. But one then guesses, obviously, that a number of those countries that have been put under pressure, and instead of a head of state, then a deputy head of state or a senior minister goes. In international diplomacy, when you send a minister to stand in for you, then you have attended. It's just that you manage the perception from those who put you under pressure. Because in the end, there's 49 countries attending the summit. That is an important one. But one does hope that out of it, Africa would have worked out specific benefit for itself and specific contribution to this relationship, so that it's not just political tourism.
Yeah. In the long term, in your view, it would be, I think, valuable. I don't know what you think, Prof, for Africa to deal and relate to many other parties. I mean, we live in an interdependent world, and rather than have its eggs in one basket, like South Africa, our biggest trading partner currently is the EU, it's the United States. It's good to look for these alternative markets and be left alone to make your own sovereign decisions.
It will be. It is actually a very fundamental principle of democracy, if you apply it to community of nations, that each individual country must take its decisions and take it freely, not under duress, not under threat, not under any form of cajoling and all of, so that they take decisions that deepen international dialogue, but also that serve their interests. What would be the impact of a country that decides to snub this opportunity because of the difficulty related to this war, when that country is actually saying it's advocating peace, it's pushing for peace, and then it stay away, and then who's going to push for peace if you stay away? But the same country does attend the US-Africa Summit. It's part of the US record on the African continent, US record in Iraq and all that. So you can't use this moral standard only once. If you're going to use it on Russia, you may not be able to attend any summit, because all of these big powers have a lot to answer for in relation to justice, fairness, in relation to violations of international law.
Okay, finally,
to engage all of these countries and call for peace and call for development, put them under pressure, but you can't put them under pressure from a distance.
Yeah, Prof, very quickly, if you may, my last question, let's come closer home. I understand there are bilaterals taking place as well. Our own President Ramaphosa will be, or has sat down with Vladimir Putin. From a South African perspective, what is the benefit of these closer relations between Pretoria and Moscow? Very briefly, sir.
Two. The important one is that a very critical principle, South Africa, but all over Africa, building friendly relations with all in the world. So this means that one. The second one is building opportunities for economic trade and investment and growing them. And this president has been very emphatic on that. And they need to strike the deals that build economic relations and grow trade and investment. If they don't, it would have been half a failure.
Thank you very much, Professor Siphamandla Zondi, International Relations Expert. He's, of course, the Director of the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation, the University of Johannesburg.